Thank you very much, Ashley. I hope you can hear me quite okay. We're having a little trouble tonight with my internet connection. It is a pleasure to be with you tonight. That first slide here's got my phone number and my email. As an employee of Premier Sheep Supply, I'm their production expert. You can contact me as well by emailing Premier, ask an expert, and they'll send that email on to me. And then I'll get brownie points with the boss because I've got more traffic and I'm more useful to them. Let's go to the next one, Ash. Can I call you Ash or do you want to call you Ashley?
No, Ashley's okay.
You don't care.
That's good.
All right, so my credentials. I was born in Indiana, so I'm a Hoosier by birth. I went to Purdue, so I'm a Boilermaker by my education. I grew up on a small farm in Indiana. My dad worked in the factory. I attended Purdue University. Was on the livestock judging team and was an officer in block and bridle. So I talk fast because of my judging experience. Once I graduated from Purdue, I worked for my neighbor on a fair to finish operation for a year and a half. I wanted to raise, he said he needed to see improvement, so I told him I was going to graduate school. My younger brother only lasted 6 months working for him though, so he's not a very good guy to work for. I got my PhD in ruminant nutrition at New Mexico State University, that's Las Cruces, home of the Aggies, which for those of you that aren't familiar, if you look at the west tip of Texas, and go north about 45 miles, that's Las Cruces. So I worked as a sheep specialist at Iowa State University for 33 years. Did everything for sheep, including teaching a class or two for several years. I'm currently working for Premier One Sheep Supplies at part-time in my retirement. Some of the big things I did while I was at Iowa State, co-developed the National Sheep Improvement Program in 1987. That was a competitive grant we got from ASI, American Sheep Industry Association. I co-developed Sheep Brands, which is our ration software, balancing software that works on Excel spreadsheets based off of the 2007 NRC. And we also have a goats brand. So I've got goats in my talk a few times. Hopefully you guys won't hate me. But we also have a spreadsheet to do ration balancing for goats. Next slide. So if we think about mineral supplementation is to provide for the animal's needs. It needs to be low cost. Feed costs have jumped way up. I'm getting lots of questions all the time about what can I feed that's cheaper? What can I feed was cheaper? Well, nothing's cheap because as soon as it's cheap and somebody finds out about it, they buy 2 more pounds of it and then it's no longer around and it's no longer cheap. I'm going to say this multiple times tonight. Livestock do not read the feed tags or the labels. They don't know what they're supposed to eat. And that's our job as producers to read the tags, know what they're supposed to eat, make sure they're eating the right amount. Now, your mineral cost per ewe per year is somewhere between $3 and $50. I've got 3 to 42. I had a guy from Missouri contact me over a year ago. He was losing some lambs. He was getting his mineral out of Minnesota. They were eating 2 ounces a day, and he was given like $40 a bag for that stuff. So his ewe mineral costs per year were $42. And he did not think that was out of line. And I'm going to try to sell you some of the Premier stuff tonight, so just bear with me. I don't do it very good yet. Switching from extension to private industry and then having to try to make money and sell stuff. So we'll see how I do. Oh, next slide, please. All right, when we think about minerals, we got macro, which are on the left side of the screen. They're required in percentage units. So calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, sodium, chloride. Micro minerals are things like zinc, selenium, cobalt, copper, manganese, iodine, iron, and molybdenum. They're required in parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. And those requirements are from about 0.3 parts per million up to 50 parts per million. So how many people are in Alberta? Do we know? Can somebody tell me that in the chat box? Guess not. I think Ashley went to sleep.
I'm gonna Google it.
But in Iowa, okay, so in Iowa, okay, 3.5 million. Awesome answer. Thank you, Laura or Lori. So if we think about 0.3 parts per million, right? That would be about one person out of the whole population of Alberta. Okay, we're talking about really, really, really small amounts. Next slide. Iowa has 3.3 million, just so you know, so we're very similar. All right, so I did get it right. The NRC was produced in 2007. It was about a 3/8 inch wide book when it was just sheep. Now that it's sheep, goats, cervidids, and New World camelids, it's about 1.5 inches thick. I did not write any of it, but I reviewed all of it, and it will put you to sleep. Next slide. All right, here's a national survey that was conducted by Larry Cora at K-State University. They looked at 353 forage samples across the United States. And when we look at the micro minerals, copper was only adequate in 36% of the cattle diets. It was deficient in 14 and marginal in 50. Manganese, most of the diets were okay, or forages were okay. Zinc, 48% deficient, 17% marginal. We always think selenium is our big micro mineral that's deficient. In reality, it's zinc. It's the most common deficiency we have, followed by selenium. So selenium, 19% adequate, 43% deficient, and 20% again are marginal. I think sheep have a higher requirement on selenium than they do on cattle. So I think we're probably a little shorter in terms of deficiencies on selenium. So we think about deficiencies, zinc's number 1, selenium's number 2 for micro minerals. The other thing we need to worry about are iron and molybdenum. In 28% of the forage samples, they had too much iron, so over 300 parts per million. And when you get high iron, it screws up the absorption of other micro minerals. Molybdenum is the same way, primarily with copper. And we're going to spend some time on copper tonight. So Dale, if I get off in the weeds on copper, you need to get me back in line because I don't feed sheep in Alberta. Next slide. Okay, so this is some data from your feed testing lab in Alberta. Published in 1995. Dale put me onto this, so this is what we're going to use for your feedstuffs. So we look at the macro minerals. Alfalfa hay we know is really high in calcium. It's decent in terms of phosphorus level. It's really high in potassium because we put too much potassium fertilizer on to grow more alfalfa. It's got enough magnesium and it's got probably enough sulfur. So alfalfa doesn't create any problems for us. Brome hay is about 0.5% calcium. If I had brome hay in Iowa, it'd be about 2.25. So this may be brome hay with a little alfalfa in it. Phosphorus is quite a bit lower at 0.16. They didn't have any values on potassium or magnesium. Sulfur again is 0.16, and that's pretty low, so sulfur could be short. Then if we think about grains, barley, corn, and oats, we know they're really low in calcium, but they're really high in phosphorus at 0.36, 0.32, and 0.32. Potassium, they're decent at 0.5, magnesium 0.15, 0.17, 0.14. So the grains are all very similar in terms of their mineral composition, whether it's barley, corn, or oats. Wheat would be very similar. Sodium was not reported on any of the reports, so I don't know what they were, but I would assume that sodium is short, which is why sheep need salt. Next slide. Okay, so the microminerals. Relative to zinc, alfalfa at 27 is just barely enough. For reproduction, we need about 33 parts per million. For growth, we need at least 25. So we're probably on the short end on zinc. Iron, you notice we've got some iron levels at 200 plus, 200 and 167, so those are pretty high. We got the rake set too low, putting too much dirt back in the hay. Don't quit on me, internet. Relative to manganese, 48 and 70. We generally have enough manganese. We don't need to supplement very much. Copper is your problem, or could be your problem in Alberta, in that you could be short. And I know that's blasphemy at a sheep meeting, because we all know that copper kills sheep if they get too much. Our problem is not the copper levels are so low, but it is the molybdenum levels are so high. Alfalfa with 3 parts per million molybdenum, a 2-to-1 ratio. Sheep on that alfalfa hay are not getting enough copper because the molybdenum is complexing with copper in the rumen, making it very difficult for them to absorb copper. Selenium in alfalfa is pretty good at 0.33 on average, and these are lots of tests. These are not 1 or 2 tests at a time, other than, oh yeah, when we go up to manganese on corn, that was only 1 sample what they ran manganese on, so I don't know that that's quite the right level. Brome and barley and corn and oats at 0.10, sorry, that's in the Premier logo. Those values are getting down to where you probably need selenium supplementation. Iodine was not evaluated, and I'm assuming that you are short on iodine in Alberta, because generally we think about being iodine deficient the further we are away from the ocean. And I know in Iowa, we don't have much iodine because we don't have any beach property. I assume Alberta is the same way. Next slide. Okay, here's some work out of Idaho that they just recently published in 2018. Macro minerals again. This is summer range and irrigated. For those of you that are running ewes out on rangeland, calcium levels were a little lower than irrigated, probably because of the alfalfa levels on irrigation. A little difference between spring and fall. Phosphorus again tends to be a little low on rangelands. Potassium is probably okay. Magnesium's a little low. Sulfur is low. And sodium again is very low on those diets in the Idaho study. So I assume that tells me also that Alberta is going to be low on sodium. Next slide. Okay, here's micro minerals. Again, zinc's really short. Iron's too high. Manganese is plenty high enough. Copper again is very low, relatively speaking. Molybdenum is higher than I would expect. Cobalt's down, maybe a little short. And selenium is really short and needs supplementation. And then again, they didn't evaluate iodine. Next slide. All right, here's some work that we did at Iowa State University in 2016, back when I was still working. This was funded by the Iowa Beef Center as well as the Iowa Sheep and Wool Promotion Board, which is our statewide checkoff. The reason I put this in here, we have a lot more copper in Iowa than you guys do. We got a lot more pigs than you do, so we got a lot more pig manure, which means we are fertilizing hay fields with copper-rich sheep or swine manure. The other thing is much more important is to look at the standard deviations, SDs. Iron, it's almost 200 standard deviations. So what it's a standard deviation says that 67% of the samples are within plus or minus 200 of the mean or the average. Zinc, again, a third of the, so it could be anywhere from down around 16 up to 40. Manganese, almost 50% of the average on standard deviation. Molybdenum, almost 50%. Selenium, again, is almost 100%. So there's a tremendous variation in selenium, at least in Iowa. Cobalt's high enough. Iodine at 0.35, standard deviation of 0.21. And currently in the new NRC, I want iodine at least at 0.8 parts per million. So we are way short on iodine. Now, I was getting ready to do a talk in Northwest Iowa. So these two producers, Mark and Shane, sent me samples that I evaluated before the meeting so we could have some local feedstuffs from Northwest Iowa. Mark has several large farrowing barn, or not finishing barns, and uses a lot of pig manure. So his copper levels were pretty high, whereas Shane's were very low. Notice also if we go down to molybdenum, Mark's were at 2.2, whereas Shane's were up at 6.8. And Shane's hay came from a rebuilt road construction area where they had a really long sloping hill. And he had bailed that after they'd redone it and had done a lot of dirt work. So with dirt disturbance, you can maybe get into higher molybdenum levels. One of the producers I worked with in Ohio was grazing his sheep on reclaimed strip mines. His molybdenum levels were very similar at about 7. And I did custom rations for him. And so we were feeding 35 to 40 parts per million copper, which in most flocks would kill sheep in about 30 days. Again, selenium levels are much higher than I would expect. And we already talked about iodine. Next slide. Okay, so here's an important schematic that was initially developed out of Texas A&M Beef Cattle Short Course in 1992. So if we think about over time, let's put sheep on a diet that has no or very low selenium levels, 0.05 parts per million. So we start out, they're okay that they're at the top of that graph. And then as we keep going, we get into subclinical disease because we're not feeding them enough. And so the first thing that happens is immunity. And we all worry about sheep and health. And one of the problems we get into is the immune system quits working, and that's why they can't fight off disease. Then we can see growth and fertility issues. As we continue on out over time and get more and more deficient, we'll start seeing clinical signs like white muscle disease and various things like that. So there's a time period, maybe 60 to 90 days, where we go from adequate before we'll see clinical disease, but it's still costing us in terms of immunity and performance. So if we get clear to clinical disease, it's going to take us a while to get that mineral imbalance shortage fixed. Next slide. Next slide, Ash. Ruh-roh.
Sorry, Dan, you're a little garbly. I changed the
Oh.
slide to the mineral interactions.
Okay, that's good. Sorry. So
That's okay.
here's an example of interactions. We've already talked a little bit about this, but copper status in our flocks is dependent upon molybdenum, sulfur, and iron. All three of those will reduce copper absorption. So we need micro mineral balancing is tricky because you got to look at the interactions and know what everything else is to know where we're at. And you can see from all those lines in that chart that lots of things interact differently. For example, zinc and calcium interact, sodium and potassium interact. Next slide. Another interaction we don't think about very often, but occurred to us once we got into the ethanol business, and distillers tends to be high in sulfur. We started seeing some selenium deficiencies because the sulfur was blocking or tying up selenium and absorption. So we were having some deficiencies with selenium and white muscle disease on lambs. And the other problem was that early on, the distillers was so cheap, you could feed a 50% distiller's diet and still be the cheapest way to go. And so we were getting lots of extra sulfur in those sheep. Next slide. That's not the case anymore. So we think about critical times for minerals and micro minerals and immunity. Stress increases urinary excretion of copper and zinc. So weaning. When we think about copper poisoning and seeing copper poisoning cases, it's usually associated with a stress event. Transport, shipping, parasitism, lactation, and cold stress, and we've had plenty of cold stress here in the last week or so. Reproduction, conceptus, and fetal development, including fetal liver mineral storage. Most of the minerals will transfer through the placenta to the fetus. So at birth, if the diet of the ewe is okay, the diet of, or the status of the newborn lamb should be okay. And lastly, if vaccination titer response, if we're short on some of the micro minerals, mostly copper, zinc, selenium, and maybe iodine, we will not have as good a response to the vaccination. We won't get as high a titer. We won't get as much protection. Neutrophil function is less, as well as other immune mechanisms that work in the sheep's body. So as we think about sheep that are just tend to not be very healthy, if we have problem flocks, it may be our micro mineral nutrition. Next slide. So as we think about how much the sheep actually need, it's dependent upon the stage of production. So we think about lactation is when they're the most productive. Other mineral levels that we've already talked about because of interactions. Age, older ewes, let's say 5, 6, 7-year-old ewes. They are not as good about drawing calcium out of their bones. So milk fever is more likely to be in those older ewes. And I think we're having way more issues with milk fever because I think we've increased the productivity of our ewes with more multiples, more twins, more triplets, more quads. Secondly, alfalfa is not necessarily the only thing we feed anymore. And so we've got to do some things to account for that and change our rations. Next slide. So here's an example on this slide for ewes, comparing ewe lambs to mature ewes. In early lactation, ewe lambs need 8.6 grams of calcium per ewe per day. There's 454 grams in a pound, so that shows you it's not very much. whereas the adult ewes need 12 grams of calcium. Phosphorus is the same way. Ewe lambs need less than mature ewes, and that's because the mature ewes are going to produce 10 to 25% more milk than the ewe lambs. So it's a production level, again, impacted by the age of the ewes. Next slide. So if we do the math on a lactating ewe, if she's getting 4.5 pounds alfalfa and 2 pounds of barley, so 4.5 times 0.24% phosphorus, that's 1/100th of a pound of phosphorus. Barley is 0.4% phosphorus, so we're at 0.08 pounds. So we got 0.018 pounds, 0.018 times 454. We're getting 8.2 grams of phosphorus into that ewe when she needs 11. So about the only time that we are short phosphorus is when on sheep is when we're feeding some really weird low quality feedstuffs or during lactation with high milking ewes. So why is that critical to me? Phosphorus is one of the expensive minerals that they put in a mineral mix. Dical currently runs about 400 a ton, whereas limestone, which is our calcium source that we use, is about 100. Next slide. So we think about meeting the animal's needs. Why do sheep eat mineral or trace mineral salt? They eat it because of the salt. That's what they're going for. Okay? You should never, ever rely on plain salt. We've already shown you that your selenium levels tend to be low, your zinc levels are low, so you need that year round. So plain salt is not enough. The feed manufacturers can add things like grain products, they can add molasses, they can add flavor to enhance the mineral intake, because the stuff we make minerals out of, like zinc sulfate, are not that tasty. So as we think about the mineral density for selenium, for example, you can have the labels be from 10 to 90 parts per million. Now, it's controlled in the United States as well, I think in Alberta, by the FDA or your federal government. And 0.69 milligrams intake per head per day is the maximum selenium we can supplement. Well, all of those minerals, even though they've got a huge range, and the density of selenium can still meet that requirement if the sheep just eat more. So from a mineral status, it's how much they eat and how much the concentration is. Because, for example, our trace mineral salt from Premier is 90 parts per million selenium, and they only need to eat 1/4 ounce per day. Next slide. Okay, and so when we're thinking about this, I put this in because I gave this talk a couple weeks ago to Pennsylvania, and I get lots of calls from people that are using kelp. And when I look at kelp, I think you should save your money. It is very expensive and it is not balanced. It does not contain enough selenium. It probably doesn't contain enough salt. And so the 3 products that are in the first 3 columns are all 90% salt. And basically the same on selenium. We sell a selenium iodine product that Dr. Kennedy came up with. It is not balanced. It does not have enough zinc. It does not have enough manganese. It does not have enough molybdenum. And it does not have enough cobalt to meet the other micro minerals. Dr. Kennedy was only worried about selenium and iodine. And my upgraded version has way more iodine than his did. Big Gain also sells a trace mineral salt, very similar to Dr. Kennedy's and mine. I don't know what the molybdenum content was of theirs. I had a client that was using kelp to improve her copper status of her sheep because her breed of sheep was copper deficient. So at 6.4, it's giving her some copper, but not very much. The more important thing is the molybdenum content of that kelp source was almost 16. So almost 2.5 times more molybdenum to copper. So copper was probably all tied up and it wasn't helping her copper status at all. So I'm not a big fan of kelp. One, it's too expensive. Two, it's not balanced. And I think I can do better than seaweed balanced in sheep rations. Okay, next slide. Here's an example mineral out of Kansas. 7% calcium, 5% phosphorus, so not very high levels. Salt is 45%, so I'd expect on that diet, that much salt, they'd eat about 1/2 ounce a day. Sulfur's at 1%, mag's at 1%, which are okay. It's short on, it had 150 parts per million zinc, which is short. It did have enough iodine and it had enough cobalt, but it had very, very low levels of selenium. They'd have to eat 2.5 ounces of that stuff a day to get enough selenium. So if they did eat 2.5 ounces, they would be peeing all over the place and your barn and lots would be wet with urine because of all the salt intake. Because if they eat lots of salt, they got to drink lots of water. Calcium, if you're using alfalfa, would not be needed. Phosphorus is probably not needed except in late lactation. And we can maybe feed distillers and corn to get that up there so we don't have to buy expensive phos. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is if you want to go from parts per million to percentages. For example, the zinc at 150 parts per million, if I would move the decimal point forward to the left, it would be 0.015% zinc. So if you can go to the left to go to percentages, go to the right to go to parts per million if you're in percentages. Next slide. So our mineral sources, we can feed a general mineral like I had from Kansas or a trace mineral salt. It only gives us the micro minerals. It is a lot lower intake. It is also a lot lower cost because it's 90% salt or 95% salt. Salt's cheap. So it might be able to, if you switch from a mineral supplement to a trace mineral, you might be able to save 75% on your mineral bill for a year. So maybe $10 a U. The other thing we need to worry about is our water sources also provide minerals. So we think about a lot of iron in the water, again, causes problems with interactions. A lot of sulfur in the water could screw up our copper status even further. Next slide. Oh, I think, did you go 2 or 1?
I think I just went 1. Yep.
Okay. Yep, you did, sorry. All right, so here's what we've got at Premier. You can buy our goat trace mineral premix. So if you think you have a copper problem, that feed for that goat trace mineral premix will fix your copper. Now it might kill your sheep with too much copper because it's set such that it'll give about a 25 part per million copper diet to the goats. Selenium, the sheep trace mineral premix comes in a 5-pound bag. You mix it with 50 pounds of plain salt. and that's plain white feed salt. You do not use iodized salt. There's plenty of iodine in it already. I think we're charging about $18 by the time you ship the trace mineral premix pack, and you can buy salt locally for probably $3 for a 50-pound bag. So it's about $18 a bag, but because the ewes only eat a quarter of an ounce a day, it'll last a long time. Next slide. Mineral availability. Okay, the form of the mineral can impact or does impact absorption. Now, these are just rough guides. I don't know the exact figures on these, but when we think about oxides like zinc oxide, we are looking at 20 to 40% absorption. If it's zinc sulfate, it's probably around 40 to 60, and the chelates like Zimpro, seleno yeast, maybe 50 to 70% absorbed. So you get more bang for your buck with chelates. However, they cost a lot more per unit than zinc sulfate or zinc oxide. There are some research in the beef cattle especially that show response to the chelated minerals. I am not so sure whether it's truly a response to the chelated mineral being more effective, or whether they were just short to begin with, or we had a requirement set too low. But again, if you've got a specific problem and need to get them caught back up, the chelated products would get there faster because of higher absorption. Next slide. Okay, so what should you guys do? I showed you a lot of results from your feed testing labs over time. I think especially if you use a lot of manure on your pastures or hay fields, you should test because you're putting mineral back out there. I would test for macro minerals. I always like to know protein and energy in my feedstuffs so I can balance rations. The study that I did at Iowa State, we used the Michigan State University lab, and they cut us a deal because we sent them 100 samples and we did 6 micro minerals. So they run about 60 to 150 per sample per mineral. So it can get pricey. But if you've got a problem, you need to know where we're at so we know how to try to fix that problem. And then the other thing is, everybody says sheep are dumb, right? That's one of the big jokes about raising sheep. Oh, they're dumb. But yet there's lots of people that think that sheep have nutritional wisdom and can balance their own diets, and they'll eat just the level of mineral they need. So if they're eating 3 ounces a day, it's because they need it. No, I think if they're eating 3 ounces of mineral a day, it's because the feed manufacturer put too much goodie in the mineral, or there's very, very low levels of salt and they're not getting their salt needs met. Minerals tend to cake up, draw moisture, especially if it's 90% salt. So you might only put out a week's supply. It'll make it last longer. It'll keep it fresher. Know how much they're eating. Because again, it's the concentration of the minerals in the mix, as well as how much of it they eat per day, that impacts our mineral status. Next slide. So we think about selenium. Best management practices for me: monitor mineral intake, read the label, know how much selenium you got in the feed. Ideally, if you're going to feed grain to your sheep, I'd mix the mineral in with the grain. It eliminates animal variation intake, and it eliminates some not eating any mineral. Plus, you don't waste any. They eat it all the time. Now, you may have to mix some vegetable oil in with that grain mix and mineral to get it to stay mixed together. Again, it's needed year round, and we already talked about the high sulfur decreases absorption of selenium, and other heavy metals can get us messed up like molybdenum and copper. Next slide. I got to finish in about 3 minutes. Copper toxicity, always use sheep-specific feeds. Don't add additional copper unless you know you've got a problem. If you've got high molybdenum levels, you need to feed copper. You can feed more molybdenum, like our trace mineral packs got molybdenum in it at basically the final ration would be an extra 0.25 parts per million. So that gets you 2.5 more parts per million copper to where it's safe. And we want a copper to molybdenum ratio of 6:1 up to 10:1. And if you go back and look at that first slide, I think you got your slides emailed to you today. When we look at feedstuffs in Alberta, your copper to molybdenum ratios are much closer to 2:1 than they are 6:1. So I'm nervous about saying this, but you're more likely probably to be copper deficient than copper toxicity. Next slide. All right, milk fever. Hypocalcemia in sheep is different than dairy cattle. Normally it happens in late gestation. And the reality is the calcium requirements are almost as high or higher in late gestation to support the fetal growth as they are in lactation. Many times it can be misdiagnosed with ketosis. If you treat with calcium, they should respond very rapidly. You can also check, close the sheep's eye so there's no light in it for like a minute, and then uncover the eye, shine a flashlight in it, and see how fast the pupil contracts. If it's slow, then we are probably looking at a calcium deficiency milk fever. You can treat them with CMPK gel. Also, you could use calcium borogluconate, and I think that's 50 mils under the skin. The reason some like calcium borogluconate is it's also got magnesium, which could also be short. One of the problems is excess potassium may increase the incidence of our milk fever. Those of you that are feeding baleage, it tends to be very high in potassium. It's also very high in soluble nitrogen. That's what we do at Premier, and we have more problems with milk fever in the last 3 to 5 years than we ever did before. One thing that we can try to do if just extra calcium's not working is work on the cation anion balance. So it's the sodium and potassium are the positive anion or ions, and chloride and sulfur are the negatives. So we can use ammonium chloride, and we can use magnesium sulfate, because in general, we've got too much positive ions and not enough negatives. So as we change those and acidify the urine, in dairy cattle, they test the urine in late gestation cows to see where they're at. And you can work on that or get a nutritionist to help work on that if you're having problems with milk fevers. Many cases, the ewe will go into labor and you might go back out there the next morning and she'll be recumbent, laying on her sternum, legs out behind her with lambs out behind her. She never got up. She got them delivered, but she never couldn't get up, couldn't clean them off, and the lambs are dead. Next slide. Urinary calculi is a calcium phosphorus ratio problem. We feed high grain diets. We showed you that on that slide. They tend to be very low in calcium, high in phos. So we need at least a 1.5 to 1, and I prefer a 2 to 1 calcium phosphorus ratio. Excess magnesium can be a problem, and I've been using magnesium sulfate to get sulfur into these lamb feeding rations to get and I think I've been causing some issues. Excess phosphorus, we don't really want to ever go above 0.4%, even though we can get a calcium phosphorus ratio correct. We don't want to get that high on phosphorus. Generally, I don't think we need to ever add phosphorus to lamb finishing rations if we're based on a high grain diet. Water management, we need to get them to drink lots of water. Flush that system out. So we need to keep the water source clean and cool. Make sure there's no stray voltage this time of year with our heated water tanks. We can add salt at 10 to 20 pounds per ton to get them to drink more water, and we can add ammonium chloride at 10 pounds per ton of the finishing ration. And that again will acidify the urine, which reduces stone formation and helps us prevent urinary calculi. Next slide. Okay, vitamins are inactivated during storage in a mineral pack, about 30-day half-life. I don't count on them to do that. If I'm going to mix or need A, D, and E, I'm mixing them when I put the mineral out, not when I buy the mineral to start with. And in most cases, the mineral levels in sheep minerals or the vitamin levels aren't high enough to begin with. For example, I want ewes to get 100 IUs of E in late gestation. And if they're eating a mineral that's 10 IUs per pound, they got to eat 10 pounds of mineral a day. So next slide. I'm getting windy and going too long. This is some work I did at Iowa State University looking at trying to improve lamb survival from birth to weaning. We were given weekly injections of Vital E, 3 cc's or 900 international units once a week in late gestation. When we started, the sheep were the same at 1.27, 1.26. Pre-lambing, the treated ewes that got shots in gestation, that's what E in gestation stands for, were better. Post-lambing, they were higher again still. And then if we didn't give those ewes that just got it in gestation anymore, they went right back to the control ewes. And milk E was about 50% higher at 3 days on treated ewes. Now, some of the ewes we kept on E through lactation, and we took some of the control ewes that didn't get it in late gestation and moved them up on lactation. And you can see if we kept giving them shots, they kept the levels very high and were better than the control or the non-treated ewes. And these ewes were on a base ration of excellent alfalfa hay, small square bales stored inside, and shelled corn. So, and they had a balanced mineral diet. Next slide. On the lambs at 3 days, they had the similar levels. But at 28 days, if those ewes didn't get E in lactation, those lambs were virtually deficient, very low on serum E, whereas the treated ewes that got E in lactation, their serum levels were much higher. So if we want to work on vitamin E, we need to give the ewes E in late gestation so that they put it in the milk and that feeds the lambs. Next slide. So best management practices on vitamin E, I'd feed 100 IUs per head per day in late gestation and lactation. I'd make sure my creep feed had 60,000 IUs of E, up to 100, which is way more than the previous NRC said. If they're grazing green grass, when they're out on pasture and the grass is green, it's got lots of E, lots of A. We don't need to worry about it. I didn't mention vitamin A, but generally if they've been on green grass in the last 6 months, they're okay. Vitamin D, as long as we got sunshine, they can make enough of their own D. Now, if you put them in a barn all winter, no sunlight, you might have problems with D levels in your ewes. Next slide. Okay. Again, late gestation is very stressful. Again, we're looking at cold stress, milk fever. We already talked about that a little bit. We can see some reduced immunity in these late gestation ewes. We shear them. It's really cold. They're not getting enough to eat. The lambs are growing too fast inside. It can increase our chances of mastitis, respiratory disease, and uterine infections. The other thing we need to think about, when they are stressed and they get disease, they have to reallocate nutrients to fight the disease and not feed the babies. So the healthier we can keep the ewes, giving them enough space, 20 square foot per ewe, make sure the pens are well bedded and dry. There's enough room at the bunk, everybody can eat and get their fair share, the better our flock will do. I think I'm done. Next slide, maybe. Okay, if you need to add A, D, and E to your mineral and 50 pounds of free choice mineral with a ½ ounce intake, I'd use 3 pounds of our vitamin E product and 2 pounds of A, D, and E. Next slide. If you think you're having problems, I do not like blood samples for mineral status. I'd harvest kidneys and liver on deads. Again, I'd sample the forages. I'd read mineral tags to know how much is in it and how much they're supposed to eat and monitor that intake. Plain salt is not enough. Sheep have zero nutritional wisdom. Put a 5-gallon bucket of corn in front of a ewe and tell me she's going to quit eating when she gets done with her pound of corn. No, she's going to eat till she's dead the next day. If you need help, this is a lot of math. Consult a nutritionist, a veterinarian, email us at Premier, and I can help you work through some individual problems if you want to. There's also another very good webinar that ASI did on their webpage on dietary supplements. It's under the Let's Grow column, if you can find that under producer resources. I think I'm done now. Next slide. And if you're mixing stuff, get a good set of scales. And now I know I'm done. Next slide. Questions? See if they can, Ashley, see if you can go to my screen. See if they'll see my face. My camera, maybe.
I can't.
Maybe not. Don't worry about it. It's all right. Don't worry about it.
There's
questions.
No, if there's questions, feel free.
I put them all to sleep.
No, you didn't. That was very, very good. And thank you so much for your presentation.
I'm still full of it, just like I was the last time I was up there.
Dan, there was a question that came through on the chat box asking, where is this product available?
Are you talking about Premier's product? I assume that's Premier Sheep Supply in Washington, Iowa. Premier One Supplies. That's who pays me.
Do you see the next question, Dan, that came up in the chat box?
Yep. I just tested for calcium and phosphorus. on the water sample. Other questions, Ashley? Oh, what are your thoughts on the Nutri-Drench? It's fine. We sell it, so it's got to be really good on Nutri-Drench. The next question I see from Rod is copper molybdenum ratio 7:1, I think is very safe. It's right in the middle, right where it needs to be. Dale, is anything I said I shouldn't have said? Dale's not going to comment. He's too good, nice a guy. Other questions, Ashley, in the chat?
I don't see any that have come in.
Okay.
Any other questions from the participants this evening? All right. Well, if I haven't seen any other
Again,
questions.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, my internet might be a little wacky tonight.
Oh, that's not a problem. I wanted to thank you for joining us this evening, and to all of our participants who joined as well. This will conclude our webinar. I will be sending an email to everyone who registered for this evening's session that will include a link to where you can access the webinar recording. And as mentioned, if you do think of any other questions this evening or this coming week, feel free to reach out to Dr. Dan Morrical. His contact information was listed on the first slide.
And I won't charge you for the first call or talk, email.